It is so important that we truly understand what we are facing in the world today, especially as Christians. And it's vital that we grasp how real this war that we are in really is. We have a tendency to not really think of it too seriously. Let's be honest with ourselves. We have a tendency to not really think about this war we are facing in this world today very seriously. But we need to really begin to understand just how serious this war really is. And I want to make a note here. There is so much I wish we could cover in looking at the release of Satan, but we're not going to be able to cover all of it. I don't want an extended 3 or 4 month series going on. So we're just going to try and get the major highlights of what's happening, and there's so much that you can do research-wise on your own, but there is some incredible stuff that we need to understand. And so I'm trying to keep this from being more than a 4 or 5 part series. And so, like I said, there's a lot of pertinent information that we will not cover for the sake of keeping this series within that framework of time. But there are some things we may touch on in other messages in upcoming sermons along the way. You know, one of the reasons I think this is so very important is it has been said, in order to defeat an enemy, one must know the enemy and understand the enemy. And so that is why it is so important that we look at what is going on so that we come to know the enemy and understand the enemy and what we're facing. The Apostle Paul told us, if you would, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. We need to keep what the apostle is telling us in mind as we look at the release of Satan and what we see happening in the world around us, and yes, within the United States. Last week, we laid some essential groundwork to help us more fully understand what we need to realize about what has been happening and what around us and what is happening in the world. And we did a quick refresher of what we talked about in our end time study when we were in Revelation chapter 20. And we noted that the worship of the pagan false gods was driven out of the public square as the gospel spread, and that is what John was referring to as the binding of Satan. We also noted that the ancient gods were not myths, but were actual powerful spiritual beings, and we know them as demons. And we also saw that in order to understand in detail what is happening around us today, we need to look at the parallels between the United States and ancient Israel, and not the Roman Empire. We also noted that the pantheon of ancient pagan gods were all the same demons that were given different names by different nations and cultures. And if we were to go back to our study of Revelation, we would remember that we had the dragon, the beast from the sea, and the beast from the land, which we've referred to as the unholy trinity. And then there was another unholy trinity in the mix. The beast from the sea, the beast from the land is above, and then there was the great prostitute. And last week we were briefly introduced to another trinity. The 3 primary pagan gods Israel began to worship, if you would, Baal, Ashtoreth, and Molech. And we notice some of the other names given them down through the centuries. And as we look, and as we will see in our look at the release of Satan, we can very appropriately call them, if you would, the detestable Trinity. They are in some ways a mirror image of the dragon, the beast, and the great prostitute. And as we look at each one of these demons and how they led Israel to abandon God, we will look for evidence in recent events to see if that god or demon has come back and is active again. For if Satan has been or is being released, we would see these demons come back into popularity and influence. Worship of these demons or false gods would return to the public square in some fashion. But that worship would probably not look exactly like it used to in Israel and be as obvious as it was in the time of ancient Israel. But before we look at ancient Israel, before the exile, we need to consider something that Jesus said and what he prophesied concerning what he said. If you would. When an unclean spirit goes out of a man, he goes through dry places seeking rest and finds none. Then he says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when he comes, he finds it empty, swept, and put in order. Then he goes and takes with him 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, and they enter and dwell there. And the last state of that man is worse than the first. So shall it also be with this wicked generation. Typically, we read this passage and all we see is a man being cleansed of an unclean spirit or demon. Then because he hasn't filled his life with the things of God, the demon returns and the man is repossessed. The demon brings more demons to join him, making the man's spiritual condition worse than he was before the demon was cast out. And while this all could be applied to an individual, the part of the passage we seem to always gloss over tells us Jesus is talking about something much bigger. If you would, so shall it be with this wicked generation. Jesus repeatedly used this generation to refer to what we know as the church age, which includes the here and now. And there is therefore no reason to take this statement of this wicked generation to refer only to the time when he was walking the earth and when he has consistently used this generation to refer to the church age in other passages. This wicked generation also therefore refers to the church age, but more specifically to the unbelieving who are living during this church age. And by unbelieving, we must include false Christians who choose to pervert the Scriptures to say what they want them to say to fit whatever they want them to be. And so what is Jesus prophesying? Well, if you would, he is prophesying the repossessing of civilization by demons. Understand, the civilization at that time was basically possessed by demons. You had the worship of false gods everywhere. You had the shrines of the false gods. Remember when Paul was at Athens and he was up on Mars Hill and there were shrines and idols everywhere. The culture, the civilization was possessed. And what Jesus is prophesying is that repossessed civilization would be more wicked than the ancient civilization that was possessed. And as we look at ancient Israel, we will see how it systematically became demon-possessed, which led to its abandoning God. And the first demon, or false god, to infiltrate Israel was, if you would, Baal. The book of Joshua gives us a look at the conquest of the promised land under Joshua. But then toward the end of Joshua's life, we come to the first chapter of Judges. Once the Israelites were in the promised land and Joshua died, there was no strong ruler over Israel. Instead, God raised up judges. Why? Well, if we were to read through the book of Judges, we would find that they didn't drive out the nations completely as they were told to do. If you would. So the Lord was with Judah, and they drove out the mountaineers, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the lowland, because they had chariots of iron. And then if you would. But the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who inhabited Jerusalem. So the Jebusites dwell within the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. And if you would. However, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tanash and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ableam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. For the Canaanites were determined to dwell in that land. And it came to pass when Israel was strong that they put the Canaanites under tribute, but did not completely drive them out. Nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer. So the Canaanites dwelt in Gezer among them. Nor did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Naholah. So the Canaanites dwelt among them and were put under tribute. Nor did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or of Alab, or Kizib, Helbah, Aphik, or Rehob. So the Asherites dwelt among the Canaanites and the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Nor did Naphtali drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth Anath, and they dwelt among the Israelites, but they dwelt among the Canaanites and the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath were put under tribute to them. And the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountains, for they would not allow them to come down to the valley. And the Amorites were determined to dwell in Mount Heres, and Aijalon, and in Shaalbim. Yet when the strength of the house of Joseph became greater, they were put under tribute. And so, they didn't drive out the nations they were told to drive out. God had warned them, if you don't drive them out, they're going to lead you astray. And we looked at that taking place last week. But why didn't they drive them out? After all, wasn't God with them? Did He say, I will go ahead of you and drive them out? Well, if we go to Judges, the 2nd chapter, we find, then the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I led you up from Egypt and brought you to the land of which I swore to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? Therefore, I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall be thorns in your side, and their gods shall be a snare to you. So it was then the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the children of Israel, that the people lifted up their voices and wept. Then they called the name of that place Bochim, for they sacrificed there to the Lord. So, once the Israelites were in the promised land and Joshua died, there was no single strong ruler over Israel. They kept turning to the Baals. They kept worshiping the false gods of the Canaanites. God would send in these Canaanites, and they would start to rule. The people would cry out. God would raise up judges and deliver them, and then it would start all over again. It was a constant cycle throughout the book of Judges. And so, if we would read through the book of Judges, we would find that because God didn't drive out the nations completely in order to punish them for their unfaithfulness, we find a pattern that begins to develop. And that pattern would be, if you would, then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals, and they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. And they followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were all around them. And they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. Notice it says Baals, plural. Each city basically had its own version. Each people group had their own version. But rest assured, they all worshipped the same demon, Baal. They just had different idols representing that demon. And so God would punish them by giving them into the hands of the nations around them. And then He would raise up judges to lead them against their enemies once they repented and turned back to God. And this was the pattern throughout the book of Judges. And Judges ends with these words that summarize the entire book, if you would. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The modern version of that verse, they did what made them happy. Don't mind what people think. Do what makes you happy. Do what makes you feel good. And that is the message of society today. Do what's right for you. And so everyone did what was right in his own eyes. One might ask, why was it so easy for the Israelites to be led astray? Let's look at a passage of Scripture we looked at last week, if you would. They sacrificed to demons, not to God. To gods they did not know. To new gods, new arrivals that your fathers did not fear. You see it? If you would, they were new gods. See, when God brought the Israelites out of Egypt, each plague was a direct assault on the gods of Egypt. And so God Almighty had defeated those gods and rendered them powerless, as far as the Israelites were concerned. But now these are new gods. Gods they didn't know about. Gods that haven't been conquered yet. And so this first god or demon we read about was everywhere. The Canaanites had named their children after them. Baal-Hanan, for instance. Even the Israelites named their children after them. Did you know that? Even the Israelites named their children after Baal. For instance, Jerubbaal. Does that name sound familiar? Oh, we know him, if you would, as Gideon. Remember, Gideon had to cut down his father's Asherah pole and burn it and destroy the altar. They named cities and mountains after Baal. Baal-Zephon, Bamoth-Baal, Baal-Meon, Baal-Gad, and others. I mean, one of the versions of Baal the Israelites followed was Baal-Peor. So what do we know about Baal? Baal was the chief god over the pantheon of Canaanite gods. His name means, if you would, Lord, owner, and master. In other words, the one who possesses. He was the ultimate god of fertility in that pantheon. The Canaanites called him, if you would, Lord of the rain. And they would pray to him and offer sacrifices to him, hoping he would make the soil fertile and bring plenty of rain so that they would have abundant crops. And so once the Israelites began planting their crops, the temptation to worship Baal became more and more tempting, for he promised fertility and abundance in all areas of life. Well, does that sound like a promise that's given out today by the world? He was the head over all the other gods, even to the point of being elevated above the true and living God in Israel. Baal became the other god to the Israelites. He was also a warrior god. He would lead the other gods into battle on behalf of the nations that worshipped him, but was always the master over the pantheon. And yes, he accepted all types of human sacrifices, including human sacrifices. And we find his influence in many cultures throughout history, including the Incas and the Aztecs, who were famous and well known for offering human sacrifices to appease the gods. But what about today? Is there evidence that Baal is back? Well, to the Phoenicians, he was known as, if you would, Baal-Shaman or Baal-Shemin. And if you remember, last week we noted that Zeus of the Greeks is Baal of the ancient Israelites and Canaanites as well. As a matter of fact, Eusebius of Caesarea, a Christian author in the first century, wrote, if you would, they regarded as God the Lord of heaven, calling him Baal-Shemin, which is in the Phoenician language, Lord of heaven, and in Greek, Zeus. And if you remember, when we were looking at the admonitions to the church at Pergamum, we noted that the great altar of Zeus was located at Pergamum. And as we noted in our Revelation study, things are really sticking together today. If you would, many scholars believe the great altar of Zeus, the king of the Greek gods, is the throne of Satan in Revelation. Starting to see the connection? Let's take that connection a little bit farther and bring us up to date. We noted in that study that in the 19th century, German engineers dismantled the altar and took it to Berlin, more than 1,000 miles away. And if you would, the so-called throne of Satan, the great altar of Zeus, went on display in the city's Pergamum Museum in 1930. Note the date. Germany and Europe were sliding into an area where they were abandoning God and embracing science and naturalism. In their minds, they were moving to become a secular society. But here's the thing. There is no such thing as a secular society. If you would, society is either God-fearing or pagan. One of the two. And so the great altar of Zeus goes on display in a museum dedicated to the ancient city of Pergamum, where the throne of Satan was located in 1930. And guess what? The design for the section of the Nazi rally grounds in Nuremberg where Hitler would be making his rally speeches was inspired by, yep, you guessed it, the great altar of Zeus. And guess what year the rally grounds were inaugurated? You guessed it, 1930. The same year the great altar of Zeus went on public display. And Baal, also known as Zeus, he welcomed human sacrifices, remember? And under Nazi rule, we had, if you would, the Holocaust. It's estimated that thousands were sacrificed in ancient times to Baal and Zeus. But in the early 20th century, Baal returned with a vengeance, and it was much worse, just as Jesus prophesied. Millions were murdered, or should we say sacrificed. Europe became pagan, not secular, and Nazi Germany led the way. Baal began to repossess all the areas of Europe where he had been driven out by the gospel of Christ. Satan was indeed being released. And the door was now open for Baal to make his way to the United States, but it was actually open long before the 20th century, although he didn't blatantly come out of the shadows until the mid-20th century. A temple for the worship of Baal, known as the Temple of Baal, was erected in Palmyra, in what is now Syria, in the 1st century. The Temple of Baal Shemin, or Baal of the Sky, was erected next to it a century later. A British scholar named Robert Wood joined an expedition to Palmyra in 1753 and afterward published the book, The Ruins of Palmyra. And the book had a profound influence on English and American architects of the era. And there is strong, very strong evidence that this book inspired elements of the Temple of Baal in Palmyra. They were inspired to be incorporated in the U.S. Capitol building. The Temple of Baal, recreated in portions of the United States Capitol building. And there is also extremely strong evidence that a drawing of an eagle from one of those temples was the inspiration for the Great Seal of the United States. Baal had made his way into the shadows of American life. Remember, if you would, Baal promised fertility and abundance in all areas of life. And so, in the 20th century, another symbol of Baal surfaces in the United States. The molten or bronze bull is erected in the financial district of New York City. The well-known, if you would, Bull of Wall Street. Did they know what they were doing? Probably not. They weren't deliberately trying to erect a bull for Baal, but that's what it represents, everything that Baal stood for and stands for. It is the symbol of wealth and abundance. And when the market is prospering, what do we call it? A bullish market. And just in case you don't believe the bull is really a symbol of Baal, something else happened on the morning of September 19th, 2016. It had been in London for a while, but on September 19, 2016, if you would, a massive recreation of the Arch of Triumph that led to the Temple of Baal was unveiled in Lower Manhattan on the grounds of City Hall, which opens out into the financial district. It is made of nearly 11 tons of Egyptian marble and rises nearly 20 feet above the ground. It remained for a week and then was moved to Dubai and then to other capital cities. as Baal is no longer in the shadows, but is in the process of laying claim to and repossessing all that had been taken from him, and more. And eventually it would make its way back to Washington, D.C., where it would be put on display there as well. Guess when it went on display there? It was put on display in defiance of the day that the Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade. No coincidence. New York City has functioned as a conduit for Baal's entrance into American civilization. America's modern versions of the temples of Baal, its houses and monuments of materialism and increase and gain are what makes up New York City. New York City is a modern-day temple of Baal. The ancient arch connected with Baal's temple with the city's main avenue. This recreated arch stood by New York City's most famous main avenue, Broadway, and is also where we find Wall Street. It is the modern equivalent to the great colonnade of Palmyra. And there on the grounds of New York City Hall is where it was erected, the heart of government in New York City. The molten bull and the arch of the temple of Baal were joined. This nation has been abandoning God and turning to Baal, and it has received the sign that it is here. He is here. The great arch, the entranceway to Baal's temple, leading to the great bull of prosperity. It was placed at the entranceway to American civilization as a symbol that he is taking possession of this great nation that was once a nation that feared the true and living God. But as we look around today, this nation is rapidly abandoning the God of our fathers. The original arch was a gateway to and from the worship of Baal. And this replica signifies that this nation and civilization have welcomed him with open arms. If you would, the United States has become a temple of Baal, a temple of Zeus, a place where Satan has set up his throne. And he is waging war against God and his faithful servants. So make no mistake, the dragon has been released. He is making war on God's people. And we're going to see throughout this study that he is coming back with a vengeance. That everything that Jesus prophesied is taking place. That when the demons return, it's worse than it was before. And we're seeing that everywhere that we see this demonic possession taking place. We need to understand how real this war is we are in. This nation is slowly being possessed by demons. We are going to be facing a war that we have no comprehension about because we have been so blessed and had it so easy in this country. And that is rapidly changing. The dragon has been released. And it, as the Scriptures prophesied, it is going to be worse than it has ever been in the past. For the believer, preparing to fight this war begins with letting God have his way. I mean, one of the things that allows Satan to make inroads into this nation is his ability to make inroads into the churches by getting Christians to not want to let God have his way. We want things our way. We want to twist the Scriptures to support things that we want, things that we want to convince ourselves are okay. And we've got groups out there that claim to be Christian, and there's something I want you to understand. I know there's a lot of people that may struggle with this, but I want to share something with you. The Mormon Church is a seat of Satan. Go out online Google temple, I think it was Utah or maybe it was Idaho, I forget which it was. It was one of the Mormon temples, and they had their baptistry. Big, huge baptistry. Guess what was surrounding the baptistry? 12 bronze bulls. We need to understand exactly what we are facing. We need to understand our enemy. We need to understand how he works and what to look for so that we recognize what's going on, so that we can take our stand, so that we can clothe ourselves with the armor of God and be prepared to do battle. Because the battle is at our front door. It's coming into our communities. It's already taking down our major cities. And it's slowly making its way here. And it's coming faster and faster. You want to prepare for the battle? Let God have his way. Let him have his way in your life and every aspect of your life. That's where it's going to begin. And once you begin to let him have his way, you'll be able to clothe yourself with the full armor of God and be prepared to face the battle that's ahead. Are you letting him have his way in your life? If you haven't been doing that, would you start doing that today? Because this battle we are facing, this war, it's not some hypothetical thing going on. It's real. It's on our doorstep. It's in our nation. And it's in our churches. Let him have his way. Let him prepare you and equip you to stand firm as you face that battle.